was thinking about starting. I'm doubling bandwidth because I got both computers running. So we are on session 4, today's agenda. We are discussing what we did last week, which was hopefully a deep dive into SOAP and REST, especially dealing with WSDLs and JSONs and all sorts of other acronyms. Agenda for today, last week we weren't able to finish off all the integration pattern presentations, so we're going to get to the rest of those today. Talk briefly about middleware because it's mentioned in some of the study material, and then we'll get on to the web services presentations. Not sure if there are any flashcards or mock exam review questions, and then we will stop the recording and we'll just have a group check-in, just kind of talk about how the group's going and how things are going in general. But right now, we're going to start with integration pattern presentations. It's going to be Terry. Prabhu is not here, but he sent his slides. So I will at least show his slides, and we'll see if anybody has had experience with UI updates based on data changes. And then I will talk about remote call-in if I can figure out where the heck I put my slides for them. And if not, then we might have to do it another time. So that being said, Terry, are you queued up and ready to go?
I think I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
Yeah, all right, let's do it. I'll stop sharing then.
All right, it should be coming through.
Yep.
All right, very good. So I had the fire and forget for the design pattern, and I didn't get all the way through last week's meeting, so I'm hoping I'm kind of on the right direction with what I put together here for my slides. But it's a data layer is where it's coming from, and then the timing of it is asynchronous. But what I was able to see is that it can be synchronous when using some callbacks. So basically, we kick it off, and we don't need to worry about too much of that. It is outbound, going from Salesforce into other applications, and we're sending one record at a time, and it's typically, it was considered for low or medium volume transactions. And we had a variety of different solutions or ways that we could implement this. We could do it with work-driven or workflow-driven outbound messaging. So that's just using standard workflow rules with an outbound message that would send to a given location. So it's called by workflow rules or approval processes. It is declarative, which makes it nice and simple to implement. And because it's using workflow, it can be invoked by any of our workflow processes. So an insert of a record or an update would cause the message to be sent. They are SOAP messages sent to the specific endpoint asynchronously. And this was a new term, and I wasn't really quite sure what it all meant here by the contract first integration, where Salesforce provides the contract. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that means that we are initiating the call, so therefore we are managing that communication that's going back and forth. Is that basically right?
So basically, this is actually, if you get a chance, it's in the session 3 recording. We actually did a brief section on this. Contract first basically means that Salesforce defines the format of the message.
Okay.
And the other system just has to deal with it.
Okay, so I'm assuming then that has to do with the WSDL that we are creating that defines
yes.
that entire payload that's moving back and forth. Then.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay, cool. So the nice thing about the outbound messaging is Salesforce automatically manages your retries. I think that's spelled wrong. So they do consider this to be some form of a guaranteed delivery. it's not 100% guaranteed, because after, I believe it's 24 hours of attempting to try, it will give up at that point. But that's a pretty good delivery process that's built in. And each outbound message can have up to 100 notifications in it. And then we have outbound messages with callbacks. And this piece, I'm not sure. I was trying to find how this operates, and I think it's via triggers, but I'm not 100% sure. So again, if you know this one and know that I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think it's basically the same process as I understood it, but it's just kicked off from the triggers versus workflow and approval processes. Does that sound right?
That does sound right.
Okay.
I mean, I know you can do an outbound message from Apex Trigger.
Yeah.
It's got to be like via future call or something, but yeah.
Right. That's what I was seeing as well. So it kind of follows a lot of the same processes. Callbacks are allowed using the session ID. So that is an advantage that we have with the outbound messaging with callbacks. If an acknowledgement isn't received, it looks like I didn't finish my thought there. If an acknowledgement isn't received, then I believe we have to manage that retry aspect of it. I could be wrong on that, but
idempotency is a really big word. Anybody want to take a stab at what it means? From what I've seen, it basically means that if you do the same thing more than once, you want to ensure it has the same result. So if you create a record and you don't know if that record got recreated, the next time you make that call, you want to make sure that you're doing an upsert, not an insert. Otherwise, you're creating a duplicate record. So that's kind of the big thing with the idempotency, is avoiding duplicates.
Okay.
So retry, but retry in such a way that if it turns out the first call succeeded, but you just didn't hear about it, that you're not duplicating your work.
Prevent duplicates. All right. Retrieving more data. So this is where your callbacks come in handy here in code, is that the outbound message is sending data from a single object. So if I am maybe sending information about an opportunity, the callback can come back in and update that opportunity with some additional data, maybe from another system. Maybe it's a foreign key to that other system, so that you know which record was updated. Again, callbacks use the same session ID for authentication and token authentication, and can be either SOAP or REST API. The use case scenario that they gave, that I was seeing, was an outbound message is sent, and then callback updates Salesforce with a unique key from the remote system. Those are considered your best options on the fire and forget solution.
Real quick on that before you leave, as far as when your first thing where you said with the callback, you could make it synchronous, but I think, and basically everything I'm reading here as well, that you're not waiting around for that callback to occur. So I think it just ends up being two asynchronous things hooked together. So you make a call, and then you go back to whatever you're doing, and ultimately the system calls back and gives you the value, but you're not sitting there waiting for that to happen before you continue on doing things, I don't think. So I think from that standpoint, does it just become asynchronous both ways?
So it's like pseudo-synchronous.
Right.
Yeah, where do I have that? Where am I noting that in here?
So the very first one is where you said the type. It could go back to synchronous with callbacks, but I'm not sure.
Oh, it was back here.
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't convinced of that either. So thank you, Jeff, for clarifying. I appreciate that. All right, great. And then the last options that they mentioned was custom Visual Force page with Apex controllers. Can also do call outs. It's a good fit. It's not necessarily as good as just using your outbound messaging options. It does require customizations, and you do have to handle the guaranteed delivery of the code. So you have to manage that response and do something with it if it does fail. And then trigger invoked Apex with SOAP and HTTP. It's called by a trigger. They don't recommend either of these last two. Also asynchronous for both of these. And then your batch Apex as well, called from a batch class. So very similar. It's just a matter of how they're called. Any questions on that, or any other thoughts or corrections maybe that I didn't clarify as well as needed? All right, Natalya, I'll send it back to you.
Okay. Next up was Prabhu. He sent me the slide deck. I think Prabhu is a he, but is not able to join the call. So I'm going to go through this. I actually have not studied this design pattern. So if somebody wants to dive in here and give better information, I am happy to learn from your knowledge. It's a PowerPoint. I'm going to try to open it in slides and see if it works. How about that? Looks like it worked. So bear with me, and I will present on my working computer. All right, and it's actually coming across. Life is good. Okay. So UI update based on a data change basically means that if you have, let's say, a Visualforce page or a Lightning component and something changes, you want your update to change as well, or your user interface to reflect the updated data. And how do you accomplish that? And here's a real life scenario that you can look at is the agent has somebody on the phone. Let's say they need to make a payment. And so the customer says, okay, I've paid it online. Do you see it reflected in your records? And if this integration is set up, the agent can say, yes, we can see your payment has come through, even though the payment happened maybe on another system that is integrated with Salesforce. How does it work? You make it work through the streaming API. So basically, the Visualforce UI subscribes to a topic. Let's say the topic is called payment made. And when the streaming API publishes an event that says, hey, a payment made event has just happened, it comes back to the Visualforce UI, and the UI receives that, it has an event handler to handle that message, and then it refreshes, let's say, a portion of the screen. And actually, that's just defined here. So you create the push topic. You select what filter conditions you want it on. It's done. You create JavaScript. And again, you create it in a JavaScript library stored as a static resource, load the static resource in your Visualforce page. JavaScript scares the heck out of me. I will say that right off the bat. I had to do the Lightning Component Super Badge for the Dev 2 exam, and that was like the worst Super Badge ever. I struggled through it. So if anybody has more experience with this, please let me know, because I am definitely not the expert here. And so what's a push topic? It's basically an S object. The push topic is written like a SOQL query. And you basically say, what do you want to be notified about? Do you want to be notified about creation of records, updates of records, deletes of records, even undeletes of records? And then you can subscribe to a specific channel. It supports custom object. Some standard objects are supported, but not all. And these are all the standard objects that are supported, as you would expect. All the big ones are here: account, campaign, contact, lead, opportunity, task. These are somewhat supported, dealing with contracts and quotes, just in pilot right now. This talks about, in Apex code, how do you create a push topic? So you instantiate it, give it a name, say, what kind of data am I looking for? I want name, phone, from the account object. So basically, this topic is looking for any changes to accounts in San Francisco. And then you say, what do you want to be notified about? And again, I'm not very clear on how all this works. If any of you have had experience with it, please provide your thoughts. And by default, you get notified of everything: create, update, delete and undelete. But if you set these to false, let's say you only want to know when records are created, set this to true, set the rest of these to false, and then it will only send back created records for you. And then if a notice does come through, so because our query said we're interested in the ID, the name, and the phone number, that's the information that comes through in the message. So here's our phone number, here's our ID, here's our name. This is JSON format, which we'll cover later today. So don't panic if it looks scary to you. It's not scary. I'll explain it in more detail when we get to the rest section of the evening. And then the message includes the channel for the push topic. So let's go back and see if we can see that. So here's the client, here's the event, and here's the event type. So this is again created, and here is the channel that the topic came across on. So think of the channel as kind of like a radio station. So you're tuned into a radio station, and if you want to listen to country, you don't care what's going on in the jazz world, you just want to listen to the country station. And wouldn't it be cool if on the country station you only wanted to hear songs by Luke Bryan and nobody else? And that's kind of like what the SOQL query does. Let's go back where we talked about the SOQL query. Oops, just missed it. So if we only care about San Francisco, this is kind of like selecting what songs do we want to hear on the radio. And let's go back to where we were. And so the channel is created, and let's see. And we're back to the beginning. And again, that was my rough attempt to stumble through all this. Oh, I just put it in autoplay. Cool. Any comments? Has anybody had experience with this? Anybody want to correct what I said or clarify what I said?
Have not done this one.
I like the radio station concept.
Simplifies it, yeah.
Yeah, or it's kind of like if you use Spotify, you know how you can have channels and you can kind of pick things for your channels. So I think of it as similar to that. Although I haven't played with Spotify much. I used to use Pandora. And like on Pandora, there's a certain so-called playlists. They don't call them playlists. I don't even remember what they call them. But like if you don't like a song, you can skip it. So I kind of think of this as if you're not interested in that record, it's like you're skipping the record and waiting for the record you really want to hear. So that is push topics. Oops, hit the wrong escape key. And then I'm up next with remote call-in patterns. So I'm double duty today. Wait for that present button. So what is remote call-in? This is basically when an outside system wants to update a record inside Salesforce. In a nutshell, that's what it does. As far as Salesforce is concerned, this is always a synchronous process. However, the calling system can decide to ignore the reply, but Salesforce always sends a reply. Technically, again, the documentation says asynchronous calls are not supported, but if the system never waits around for the reply, then that's kind of asynchronous and requires authentication with a login and a session ID. What are the use cases? Using the standard SOAP and REST APIs to access Salesforce records. You can do up to 200 records per call-in, so definitely not necessarily the tool you want to use if you're doing thousands of records at a time, because that's a lot of call-ins and you might start hitting governor limits. If you're doing a query request, by default, you can get 500 rows at a time. And one of the big limitations is every call only acts on a single object. So you can't send in a request to update an account and its related contacts at the same time. You can update the account, get the reply back saying the account was created or updated, and use that account ID to then send in a second message to update contacts related to the account or create contacts related to the account. But you can't do it all in one call. So one call per object. And if you're using Salesforce's bulk API, the actual request is sent through synchronously. So we make a request to the bulk API, and again, Surabhi is going to be covering bulk API more next week. But we call into Salesforce. We say, hey, Salesforce, I got a batch for you. The reply is, okay, I got your batch. Here's the job number. And from there, that's the synchronous part of the process is done. The actual processing is happening in the background as processing time allows. Eventually the job gets finished, but it's up to you to check on the status of the job and see how it's going. So that's the best use cases, using the standard APIs. Suboptimal use cases, not so great. If you're writing a custom web service, let's say you wanted a web service that in a single call could create an account and a contact and an opportunity all in one call instead of making 3 separate calls, you'd be writing a custom web service for that. And you'd have to make sure that you have good try-catch patterns in there, make sure that all the logic happens, make sure you have a fully committed transaction. And why is it suboptimal? Because of the maintenance cost of supporting custom code versus just using standard Salesforce API call-ins. Oops, wrong mouse. And that is the end of the presentation. Any questions on this one? This one seemed kind of straightforward. It was basically, if you want to update stuff in Salesforce, use Salesforce's standard APIs to do it. Was kind of what I got out of this.
Yeah, unless you want more control.
Yeah, if you want more control, again, and that actually brings up the next topic, which is, what if you do want more control? And so the question becomes, well, what about this thing called middleware? And I pulled a couple of quotes out from one of the suggested reading documents. I think this was in week 2 or 3. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but it basically says, rather than creating your own solution to integrate, first see if there's middleware that can do the job for you, because then somebody else has the headache of maintaining all the code, and you don't have to have that headache. And so the thing that really stood out for me was this quote here: the more that Salesforce is made to be the hub of integration activity, the more time you will spend building, maintaining, and troubleshooting integrations as opposed to building new business value. And so they're really pushing the concept of use middleware whenever possible. And especially now that Salesforce has acquired MuleSoft, which is very good at being a middleware solution, I think we're going to see more and more of that push of don't customize. And if you've done the App Builder exam and you've done the Dev 1 exam, you know there's always questions about, do you write it custom or do you go to the App Exchange and see if somebody has already built that better mousetrap for you? And so has anybody here worked with any middleware? Can you talk about any pros or cons that you've seen on using somebody else's middleware solution versus writing your own? Or has anybody tried to write their own and regretted it?
I've not read my own. I've used Informatica quite a bit,
Okay.
both cloud and on premise. And it, you know, it's very quick, very easy. You definitely can set up 2 connections and push data through relatively quickly. Easy to maintain. Probably the one downside I would indicate with that is when you need to make transformations, you're now putting, let's say, business logic or what your transformation is into a centralized place that may have to be repeated if you connect to different systems that need to do that same transformation versus putting that on either end where you know you need to make the data change to whatever it needs to be. So that's one of the downsides is you're now building your business logic into a third party application that you may have to maybe more difficult for either side to understand. Well, I have field called A and I send you the value 55, you have the field called B and you've changed it to 73. Why? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? That you now have to have somebody in that middle area say, well, we decided that's what that mapping would be. So that's probably one of the downsides. But you can push a lot of data through with these things, and like I say, stand them up fairly quickly.
Yeah, I know one project I worked on for a nonprofit, they were using a lot of outside tools. I mean, they had 5 or 6 different tools, and some of the tools had their own very nice Salesforce integration created for them already that we could use. But then some of them, there's a website called Zapier, or maybe it's Zapier, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Z-A-P-I-E-R. And they basically make it very easy to connect 2 different systems together through what they call a zap. And you could chain even multiple systems together. And so we actually used Zapier to connect a couple of the systems together so we wouldn't have to write that custom coding for them.
Yeah, I've also used Informatica as well with a client and have had real good luck with it. It's a client that doesn't have the technical skills, so I was able to implement it and kind of leave and forget, and it's just been dead on all the time for them. It rarely creates a problem. I've also used Workato. I don't know if you'd consider that quite the same, but it in essence is acting as a middle tier between two systems as well. A little bit more challenging. It's not quite as straightforward on some of what the capabilities are, but
the other thing that I noticed, and kind of going back to where you would write a custom web service versus utilize Salesforce's underlying, is, and I know we've all done this, your opportunity where you have multiple amount fields that mean something different, and you might come in and implement a new one, and now you know the fields you have to get contact, you may not be using the standard address fields or whatever else. By writing the custom API, you can hide all the different things that maybe change within your database and just present a common way. You want to add an account. I need a name, I need an address, I need everything else. And then you in your custom code determines where, when I get that address field, do I actually place it, within a database, versus forcing somebody who's connecting. Our opportunity has 595 fields.
Oh my God.
So can you imagine somebody in the middleware that hooks up to our opportunity and wants to start pulling data, and they look at that and say, what is By the way, most of those fields got there before I got here, but I didn't put 595 in. But could you just imagine that the overflow you would see when you see that, versus writing a web service where I can expose, here's the 20 fields that you're interested in. I'm going to give you those 20 back every time. And you don't have to worry about the other 570 that are in the database and potentially grabbing the wrong thing. You grab amount because everybody says the Salesforce uses amount. Well, we have a custom field that we don't use amount.
Right.
So you would miss that. So.
And that right there is an example of contract first development, where you've defined this is going to be the contract. Don't worry about what we do behind the curtain with the contract. The contract is always going to look like this, no matter what we do on the back end.
Exactly. And when you have multiple people connecting to you, that's the best way to go. If you got 4 or 5 different systems all coming in, it's best to define what that contract is. You know that that's always what those systems are going to get. And you don't have to coordinate them when you all of a sudden change a field, change the way you're doing something, change the logic on a calculation that impacts them. You can hide all that and just continue to provide the same thing out to the other thing. So that's where sometimes the middleware or going straight to Salesforce's API.
Yeah, especially if you're working with a vendor, right? Like if you have to actually expose certain data just to an external vendor, maybe that's where you go with custom services, versus when you want to coordinate your enterprise data traffic, if you will, maybe that's where you use more of the middleware, because you're trying to orchestrate which information goes from point A to point B in which order. So I've experienced quite a lot of customers where, let's say, they merge 2 accounts in their MDM, and they're trying to pause certain of this set of integrations before they turn on the rest of the integrations and then sync information to Salesforce and merge them in Salesforce. In that case, having a middleware in a place that manages the traffic between all of the internal, like their systems, not vendor systems, it's kind of important as well.
Very cool. Any other thoughts on middleware? Trade-offs on middleware.
I've worked on web methods. Well, I've not directly worked on web methods, but one of our projects we're using web methods as a middleware. I think what we had observed was the same thing, which I think you mentioned, that it was once the data reaches the middleware, we were like off the hooks and we didn't care what happened beyond that. They were responsible for making any retries or any exception handling if needed. But that was a simpler, integration. We didn't have multiple systems. We just had Salesforce connecting to the middleware.
Okay. So let's talk about cost. Cost of middleware, because it ain't cheap, usually isn't free, versus the cost of development. What do you guys think? What's cheaper in the long run? What's cheaper up front?
Middleware usually, I think, in the long wear. Well, I guess you have most of them. You have perpetual licenses, so once you pay, you're going to pay that ongoing. But if there's a lot of that too depends on whether they're internal or external. So the cost of the hardware for them to sit on. Initial setup, I've done both. You can get middleware up and running so much faster than you can write integrations between systems, write the code that needs to do it. So the initial startup is much easier with middleware, more expensive upfront for people, but then depending on how you write the code, it could just sit and run where you still have to pay the license fee for the middleware, on and on and on.
Right.
Yeah, I think some of it too depends on how much integrations is that client going to be doing. I mean, if they've got a lot of integrations, that's going to be an awful lot of code to end up customizing and writing. So in that scenario, it might make more sense to use middleware, ESB type solution where
Right. If you end up needing, so if you're going to pick one object, this other system's going to deal with accounts, and all you're going to do is accounts. That's one aspect. But if you're going to deal with accounts and leads and contacts and opportunities, you're now talking a lot more, like you said, custom code to support all of those, versus the middleware, where once you have the connection done, you're really just spinning up different objects from that connection.
Yeah, and sometimes too, I think it depends on the skill set of the client. If you're in an organization that has resources leverage, then by all means do some development if that makes sense. But if it's a shop that's mostly just admins and they don't have the developers to build it out, their options are limited.
Any other thoughts? All right.
Probably only the other, I guess, final thing I'd do is involving with security. When you use middleware, you typically connect that middleware to Salesforce with like a service level license, or really whatever license you use doesn't matter. But that's kind of what's now been set up for other connections into that. So if you just had a one-to-one system, you kind of manage, here's what accesses come in. But let's say now you're hooking up 3 or 4 different other systems through the middleware back into Salesforce. That Salesforce to middleware is usually through a single ID. So now if you want to have different controls between those 3 systems, you're now limited. Because you're kind of setting it up to the most available so that the one who needs more permission can get through. But now the system you want to restrict somewhat, the connection's there. So it's difficult to say I want to have this between these 2 systems to have less capability than between 2 other systems.
So that's where you now your middleware is going to have to handle some of that security for you at that point.
So you're shifting the security over to the middleware, because from the Salesforce perspective, you can't really control because it's a single connection over. So your middleware now has to manage security.
Yikes.
Yeah, and I think I've seen in the projects I've seen this particular license which we provide to the middleware is like it can access everything. It's kind of the broadest level access you give. So if you need security control, it would rely on the middleware. Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. I think we've exhausted that topic pretty well. Let's see. WSDL XML was the next thing on the slide deck. So we're going into the SOAP part of the presentation now. Runa couldn't make it. I do have a slide deck available though, so stand by. Let's see. Whoop, too far. And let's see. And so what the heck is WSDL? What the heck is XML? So XML stands for, I believe, Extensible Markup Language. If you've ever seen HTML code, that's basically a flavor of XML. It deals with open tags and closed tags. That's not really covered in these slides, but there will be an XML example later on, possibly in some of the presentations in the SOAP section, and will also be a sample in the JSON. But Salesforce specifically uses what's called a WSDL, which is an XML format. WSDL stands for Web Services Description Language, and it's a map of what the API does. It tells you how does it connect, what data structure does the request have to come in, what data structure does the response have to come in. In Salesforce's case, we have two different flavors. We've got the Enterprise WSDL and the Partner WSDL, and we have people that will be talking about that, so I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder here. But Enterprise, optimized for your enterprise, so to speak. And Partner is much more generic, can be used in multiple different Salesforce orgs. I guess the key takeaway is the Enterprise WSDL will be different from org to org. The Partner WSDL will look the same from org to org. And some APIs only support XML. Some APIs support XML or JSON, as you can stop that. I keep hitting autoplay. Some APIs support both JSON and XML formats. The SOAP API only supports XML. The metadata API also. So anything SOAP related, you're pretty much stuck with XML. Anything REST related, you have a choice of XML or JSON, or in some cases, even CSV files. Yeehaw! Again, these are not my slides. These are Waruna's slides, who could not be here. So that is the presentation I have. And Swati, that leads us to you and the Enterprise WSDL. And let me stop sharing so that you can share yours.
Sure. Yes, can you guys see my screen?
It's coming across. Yep, we got it.
Cool. So yeah, like Natalya mentioned, we have two different kinds of WSDLs, and I'll be talking about the Enterprise WSDL. So this is generally used for web services where it's a generic single type of connection between Salesforce and an external system. Talking about the WSDL, it's basically strongly typed, and I'll explain that in the next one. But it basically has objects, fields, and configurations specific to the organization where it was downloaded from. Meaning that if you download two different enterprise WSDLs from two different Salesforce orgs, they will most likely be different because of the different configuration on both the orgs. Oops. So yeah, like I said, this WSDL document is used generally where we are building like a single integration between a particular Salesforce org and an external system. When we say that it's strongly typed, it means that it will contain objects and fields which are specific to your org. It will have the exact data types, including int, string, and the complex data types, which could be your standard or custom objects which are built specifically in your org. This model generally is easier because you have specific data types when you're writing the code from the external system, and you're able to compile it correctly. It will not allow you to save the code if you are referring to something which is not present in that Salesforce org. So it will make you use the particular data types or the objects or the fields which are present in that Salesforce org. So that's also an advantage of using this, that you don't really have to, it's kind of a validation which happens at the compile time. The downside of this is that if you make any changes in your Salesforce org, you'll have to regenerate the WSDL. For example, if you added a new field or a new object, it's not present in the last version of your enterprise WSDL. So you have to regenerate that and then supply it probably to the external system again, and they have to consume it. So that's one disadvantage of using this. And generally it's not used where we are making a generic solution for which can be used in different orgs, because it's kind of typed and strongly typed, as I say. Any questions till now?
So if I'm, let's say, an ISV and I want to build an app for App Exchange, I would not want to use the enterprise WSDL.
You will not. Yes,
Okay.
yes, definitely.
So when you say you need a new version when you add new fields or objects, is that only if you want to then have access to those new
Yes.
objects?
Yes.
So you could continue to use the current WSDL, you just would be the old.
You would be using the old version. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, as long as.
And that could present a problem if a field was actually deleted.
Right.
You
Exactly.
had that field in there, but in theory, you could keep using your same WSDL. You just wouldn't have access to anything new.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, it's only required if you need to accommodate the new changes or additions. So, where do we get to actually download the API? It's on the classic version. We go to, we generally use a quick find on the left panel, but you're able to see all the APIs in the screen. And once you hit the generate enterprise WSDL link on the screen, this opens up, which is actually your entire enterprise WSDL. Like I mentioned, it's difficult to go through all the tags right now, but just to mention, I will probably add some good resources which I found, which were kind of explaining, the WSDL in more details if anyone wants to go through them. Generally, this has, like I mentioned, has your object, your field specifications, and you can see where, it has all your objects under these complex types. It also has, in this particular example, if you look at the last expanded tag, it has your custom metadata type and the custom fields, mentioned specifically with those API names. So it really reflects whatever is present in your current Salesforce org. I will go to the next one. So this is something which I had tried way back, but it's also good information, because what I was trying to do is consume the WSDL on a Java client and see how what it generates. If you look at the right side, these are the classes some of the classes which are generated from the WSDL, and these are very specific on as objects like account, contact. So when I'm creating this Java client or Java program, this I'll have to use something like a contact type, because it's not normally present when you import or consume the WSDL. It actually creates this class or complex data type for you, and you're able to use that in your program, where you're being able to use this object the way you would use in Apex. So it's like a data type which is created for you once you consume the WSDL. It's different from partner WSDL, I think, which will go next, where you use kind of a generic S object. But here with enterprise WSDL, you can actually use like accounts and contacts and any specific objects which are present in your Salesforce org, the way we would use it in Apex. So this program is just a simple Java program which actually just queries your contacts and tries to get the specific fields. One of the other things which I was reading through when I was going through this was that with this you're able to actually, if you look at this particular line where contact, we are just retrieving the record, and the next one where we are actually getting the first name and last name. The way you normally do it is these methods are actually present for you. When you consume the WSDL, you can actually do like a get first name of a contact, first name being a field on that object, last name, and any other custom fields also can be retrieved by a get method. So the syntax would normally be like a get and then the actual field API name, and a method is present if you want to retrieve that field from that particular record.
So in that sense, it's a lot like a Visualforce controller then.
Yes, it actually
get
becomes
plus the field
similar.
name.
Yeah. So this actually is kind of it makes it similar to how you use it in Apex. So it's kind of easier to understand also and relate to it.
So does Java have, because in SOAP, I can't, or not in SOAP, in Salesforce, there's a utility. It's called like XML to code or Apex to Apex to WSDL. I don't remember. There's a utility that takes the WSDL and creates all your code classes for you. Does Java have something similar? Is that how you got all these com.sforce classes to?
So this is actually I think used something called tools.jar. So that is something which is available, which can actually convert your WSDLs to these classes. I had used Eclipse, and it was I can probably look at it more. This was way back. This is a screenshot from the Salesforce docs, but I think I'd used tools.jar, and there was another utility which I was using. Probably have to look at it again, but I can come back to you.
Okay. Yeah, from what I've seen, basically there's a lot of utilities out there that you don't have to recreate stub classes. You take the WSDL in, you run it through a nifty utility, and it creates all these classes for you. So in your code, it's almost like you're not even calling a web service, because
exactly.
if you look, it just looks like you're calling methods, but they just happen to be web service methods.
Yeah, I think that's the basic idea of using a WSDL and consuming it. For you, it's like you are actually calling a local, local method or a local service, but it actually makes the call out for you, and you are just putting the right syntax on what method you're calling and what arguments you're sending and what you're returning. So it kind of hides all of that, abstracts it for you.
Very cool.
And last is, this is just what I was saying, where you can actually, this is like a custom object, and you can use specific fields where we talked about get methods. Similarly, there will be set methods where you can actually set the corresponding and specific fields using this particular syntax, where I'm using set candidate _ C. So that's the kind of syntax we can use when we consume. This is Java, but I think it will work for all. So that's it from my side. Any questions?
Very nice, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, can you go back to the slide 4?
Yes.
So the only thing I wanted to point out here, just on XML format, the big thing to note is anytime you have an open tag, you have to have a close tag. So you'll notice, like on the complex type lines, you have an opening tag of complex type, and you have that closing tag with the /complex type to close the tag. And then the other way to close tags, farther down where you see the element types, you see it opens and closes the tag in the same line with just that / and the greater than sign. So just like with well-typed HTML, if you've ever had to create a Visualforce page, if you open a tag, you must close the tag, otherwise things don't work well.
Yep. And I think there is also a very good resource if we want to understand like a WSDL in more details. Going through this can be kind of overwhelming, because there are so many tags which you need to look at, and just expanding them becomes like expanding or collapsing them. So I was just trying to do something hands-on, where I created a small program, like a Java program, and I generated the WSDL to see how it looks like. So that might be a good exercise to do if you want to understand what a WSDL exactly contains and how it translates from your own program. So.
Okay. Yeah, if you could post a link to that, if there was like a web page you were following for that exercise, that would be just posted on the study resources sheet.
I actually did post that.
Oh, great.
One.
Okay.
It's a YouTube link, so it actually takes you through everything, the setup. it's very good.
Very cool.
Cool. Thank you.
Svatka, you're up next.
Okay. Let me go ahead and share. So partner WSDL, I think we talked a little bit about WSDL. We already talked about enterprise WSDL, but I thought I would do compare contrast a little bit here. So here's the picture that we just saw that Swati sort of presented in a little different way, just in a compare contrast with the partner WSDL. So I'm going to go back up to enterprise right here just for a real moment. And like you said, complex type here is more of an abstract area. It has the account also written over here as object, whereas in partner WSDL, you can see it more as a dynamic object. So we already talked a little bit about it's a lucid type WSDL. Where consumer relies heavily on a producer. You can dynamically fetch Salesforce configuration data, such as custom objects here. And I think, Natalya, you already mentioned ISV, right? So if I am an App Exchange vendor or ISV or partner, or I'm trying to connect to more than one Salesforce org, most likely I will want to use partner WSDL. There is also the whole concept of, and where I try to tie it sort of back together, and you have already sort of touched on it, Natalya, here. So I am semi-repeating what you already said here, but just trying to bring it back to sort of real world here. Typically where you would be, exposing your WSDL is maybe in an integration pattern like remote call-in, right? Where you're either exposing direct API or you're writing those custom web services if you're trying to do something like a multi-object changes in a single transaction. What's an interesting comment that I have seen, there was the whole sort of notion of if you use SOAP, you're going to go with partner WSDL. And then the concept you're using REST over SOAP. If someone wants to challenge to go with REST versus SOAP, I think there are really good books, O'Reilly books that you guys can go and look at it. I'm not going to go into that concepts or the conversation per se, but just thought that I would just reconnect back on we talked a lot about what enterprise WSDL is, that you have to actually go in and always re-download if you change or delete something. With partner, you don't, because it is dynamic and it just basically recalls that, and you can call the definition on demand. So I'm going to pause right here. I know I went way more faster than Swati, but I feel that, Natalya, you have already touched on the formats, the XML, the WSDL. Swati touched on enterprise. So this kind of ties it back together.
So how would I, using this WSDL, how would I query Salesforce to say, hey, give me a list of all your objects? And sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here. If you don't know the answer, that's fine.
I don't have the right.
I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, maybe I'm gonna post it for you on. I'm gonna post it on the Slack.
Okay.
Yeah, might be better.
Okay.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I think the way partner WSDL generally works is from the code side. The way I was showing on my screenshot where you can instantiate a particular object, like using account C, account A is equal to new account. In partner, you would be just doing like an S object is equal to new object. You would instantiate a generic S object and then you would set the type as account. So that kind of code can work for
okay.
a lot of other objects, but you just need to set a different type on each instantiation.
Okay, so instead of the name being contact and sending in an ID of a contact, we say name equals S object, and then the type element would be set to contact.
Yes. And similarly for the field as well. Instead of setting like a particular field, you would be like set field, and then you would mention the field API name in like quotes. So it's more generic that way.
Okay. So basically, you're sending the field names in as parameters inside the tag.
Right. Pairs. There you go.
Nice. Any questions here? All right, Atul was up next. Atul is stuck on client projects and can't join us today. But Swati, you did what he was going to do, which was some demo of accessing SOAP from code. So Atul thanks you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Or he will thank you when he hears the recording.
Sure, sure.
That leads us to dealing with REST now. And I've got the first topic here. I'm going to do JSON basics. And then Nicole, you're up after me with setup steps. And then Jeff, you're up for doing a demo of REST Explorer. But we'll start with JSON basics, and I will present first. That one. Okay, so JSON, JavaScript object notation. If you've worked a lot with JavaScript, JSON will look very familiar to you. If you're like me and JavaScript scares you, then try not to run screaming into the night. What does JSON look like? There are no less than greater than brackets like there are in XML. Instead, you're going to see a lot of curly braces. You're going to see square brackets, colons, commas, and double quotes. The generally accepted characters is an object is enclosed with curly braces. So if you see curly braces, think object, just like a Salesforce object. If you see square brackets, think arrays. Just like in programming, if you have an array, you probably have square brackets somewhere. Then you have these things called name-value pairs, which I'll go into in the next slide. And you separate the name from the value by a colon. And then you separate each pair of name values with a comma. Names are always strings, and in order for something to be considered a string in JSON, it gets enclosed in double quotes, and that's how the JSON parser knows that it's double quote, it's a string. And so what is a value? A value can be a string. Again, the thing that makes it a string is it gets enclosed in double quotes. A value can be a number. The way you make it a number is you don't enclose it in anything, you just put a number. And I'll have some examples on the next slide. There are also 3 keywords that you can use in JSON that stand for Booleans or they stand for a null value. These are case sensitive. They must be lowercase. If you try to use uppercase, you'll get a parse error. Unless you have a really robust parser, but generally you want to use lowercase. A value can also be an object, and you can nest things, and I'll show you an example of that as well. And finally, a value can be an array, which is a list of objects. So what does that actually look like in real life? So here's some basic example. Here is a sample valid JSON bit of stuff. So on the left, before the colon, this is our name. And you'll notice it's enclosed in quotes because it's a string. So this name is called string name. This name is called my number. This name is called not a number. And the thing after the colon is the value that's assigned to that name. So it basically tells the program, hey, create this variable called string name, and it has a value of this is a string. So here is where things get a little tricky. What happens here, because it's got double quotes, is the parser will treat this as a string and literally save it with all those characters in it. Now you notice here, however, after the colon, there are no double quotes here. There is just the number 5. This will be treated like a number, but this 5, because it's in quotes, will be treated like a string and not a number. This true here, because it does not have quotes around it, will be treated like a Boolean value. But this value of true, because it does have double quotes, will be treated like a string. This null, because it doesn't have quotes, will be treated like a null in a database or programming. But this null in double quotes will be treated like the string, which has the value of null. If you're not sure, oops, didn't want to stop sharing there, sorry. Let me get my screen back. And sometimes when you're playing around with JSON, the best way to play around with it is to find an online, it says I'm presenting, but I'm not presenting, am I? Yes, I am. Okay, good. So one of the best tools I've found online is called the JSON parser. Let me just bring that up, and JSON parser online. So if I take the value from this slide. And let me just double click into here, select everything, copy, and we go to the JSON parser. And I type the text in here, and it will tell me how the receiving system is going to parse it. And there's this nifty little toggle switch here called Show JavaScript Types, and it will show you how is it treating it. So you'll notice the things in quotes, it treats like strings. The things without quotes around them, it treats them like numbers or like Booleans, or in this case, it kind of depends on what the object type is, but it's a null value basically. So again, as I said, the Booleans and the nulls are case sensitive. So if I tried to type true here, it's not going to like that. It says true is not really a Boolean value. And so again, case sensitive. Oops. One other, so that's an example of how you can use JSON utilities. This is one of the better JSON parsers I found. Again, jsonparseronline.com, nice easy URL to remember, and I will add that to the slide itself so you can have it there. So what happens if you send this message through? Anybody want to venture a guess? Let me give you a couple options and we'll do a little vote. So option A, it's going to create three variables with my name. It's going to create an array, and one of them is going to have the value Alex, one's going to have the value Lynn, one's going to have the value Sam. Option B is it's going to store Alex and it's going to ignore these other two lines. Option C is it's only going to store the last value, which is Sam, and option D is you're going to get a parse error and nothing's going to happen. So who wants to vote in the comments on what's going to happen? Nobody wants to venture a guess. Terry says C. Nicole says just Sam. Well, let's see. Let's use our handy dandy JSON parser and see what happens. And we'll give it time. Now, why is this not? That's strange. It's not reloading. I might have to. Well, that didn't work. Okay, but the answer is, there it goes. Okay. So just like if this was code, if you were writing code and you assigned a value to a variable, and then you assigned a different value to that same variable, and then you assigned a different value to that same variable, it would only keep the last variable. And JSON works the same way. Because there is just commas by all these, it just keeps overwriting the value. And you end up with my name is Sam. My name has the value of Sam. But what if you really truly wanted 3 objects to be created? What if you really wanted an Alex and a Lynn and a Sam? How do you do that? That's where the concept of an array comes in. You'll notice I have square brackets here and here, which says, hey, JSON parser, I got an array coming your way. And you'll also notice I've enclosed each name value pair in curly brackets, which has now turned this pair into an object. And so now we have an array indicated by square brackets of objects. Each object is enclosed in curly braces with commas behind it. And if I copy this, and if JSON parser is actually responsive this time, we should see that now we've created 3 objects, and each object has a field inside it called my name, and each of the 3 different values are assigned. And then that was that example there. And then you can also nest objects. So again, the name of our object is account. We see that because it's on the left side of the colon and it has quotes around it, so life is good. And account has multiple attributes or fields inside it. It has an attribute called name, and it's a string, as you can see by the double quotes. It has an attribute called employees, which is a number because there are no quotes, it's just 100. And it has an array. It has a name as contacts, but it's got square brackets, which means there's a list of things coming, and the list of things is 2 objects, And we know that because each thing is enclosed in curly brackets, and then they're separated by commas. And so if we plug this into the parser, this will be very similar to how you might create an account with contacts in Salesforce. So you'll notice here's our account object, and inside that account object, we have a field, and we have this compound field, which consists of 2 contacts inside it. And there's contact 1, and there is contact 2. And then, so that's JSON. How does it compare to XML? So for XML, we have these open and close tags. You have open employees, close employees. Here's employee number 1. Here's employee number 2. Here's employee number 3. Here's the same data represented in JSON format. You'll notice it's a lot less words on the page. So lighter payload as it's coming across the internet. We don't have all these open and close tags. Instead, we're just using curly braces or square brackets to open and close and encapsulate objects together. Much smaller payload coming across. Any questions? Please don't make them too technical because I'll freak out. Okay. Nicole, then you are up with how do you set up a REST web service?
Okay. So everybody can hear me okay. So I'm going to go ahead and going to share this screen. You can see it okay. Hopefully
Yep.
Okay. So I know we've talked about this, but it kind of helps me to kind of have some more content around what I'm talking about, because otherwise I felt like it was really small. So I'll go through it quickly, and I hope that I caught everything. So this is something I've never done before. So this is brand new to me. So hopefully I got everything. So if you see something out, just let me know. All right. All right, safe harbor's done. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. I'm someone that I like to just kind of note what things stand for. So probably never need to know it ever, right? Nobody cares what it stands for. Lightweight alternative to SOAP API. It uses the HTTP protocol, so you get to use native HTTP methods such as get, post, and patch. We'll go through those in another slide. It's stateless, so it doesn't store any of your client information on the server. It's synchronous, so you get a response back, and that also I put in there that follows your request response pattern. Setup and authentication, so you can use an integration user, and if you use a user for your integration, you have to select that the API is enabled for that user on their user record. Optionally, you can also say that this is an API-only user record, which is another checkbox on their user record. So if you don't want them to have access to the interface in Salesforce, you can mark them as an API-only user. Or you can use a connected app, which we've gone through in previous weeks. So you can use OAuth 2.0, which was my topic last week. And you can create that connected app, enable your OAuth settings, specify your callback URL and your OAuth scopes. I have no idea what those are. And then you can also specify a session ID. And I did read that you could call and get a session ID through the SOAP API if you wanted to. So those were your 2 ways to kind of set up your connection. Okay. So your HTTP request, what does it look like? So it has 4 components. It's going to have your request header, which is going to have your authorization token in there so that you have access to the environment. It'll have a named URI for getting your resource. It will have your request entity in either a JSON or an XML format. So that's been mentioned earlier on this call that if you're using REST, you can use either or. And it's going to have your HTTP method. So what action are you performing on the resource that you're trying to get? So again, your example here would be like a post. So I did put in here constructing a named URI because I've never done that before. So you have to have the instance of your org, your API version, and your resource path. So I just took this snippet from the video that was in our content to study for this week. And that kind of helps me see those. So that is getting your named URI.
I'll have a lot more of these when we get to my section.
Yeah,
so.
I'll let you take it. So what methods? I've never used these before, so I thought this was good, just as like a quick reference. What methods you can use? These are your HTTP methods. So you can use head to receive metadata, get to query data, post to create a record, patch to update a record, delete to delete a record, and put to upsert a record. How do you specify your format? So JSON is your default format. You can also use XML, so you can either specify it in your HTTP accept header, which would look like this, or you can include it in the extension in your named URI, which we showed on the previous screen. And then I just put in here, when you make your call, you're going to send your HTTP request URL in JSON to Salesforce. It uses the same security protocol. So you have to send it through HTTPS. You can't send it through HTTP. And I believe it's using that TLS/SSL, whatever we want to call that now, version that is supported through Salesforce. And then Salesforce returns the HTTP response in JSON. And if there's an error, it'll send you the error code, and then you can handle the response however you want to handle it within your client. So your responses can be compressed. I added that as well. So with encoding. And then you can set up your custom endpoint using the @REST resource to declare an Apex class as a custom endpoint. And then I did include also the REST classes that are available. So you have REST context class, which contains your REST request and your REST response objects. And then your request class, oh, sorry, my screen went black. Hold on. Allows you to pass data to a web service, and then your response allows you to take it from a web service back. I think that was it.
Any questions here?
I went really fast, but I also don't entirely know what I'm talking about.
That's why we're all on here, because you learn best by having to teach somebody else. And Surabhi, I believe you're dialed in from an airport, so welcome to the party. I'm guessing that's you that's dialed in on the 908 number.
Actually, it's me. This is Swati here. My internet broke down, so I joined.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, welcome back then.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Nicole.
You're welcome. I was like, there are a bunch of sample Apex classes in the developer guide, and I feel like at some point I need to just, play with the command line and throw some stuff in there and see if I can get something to happen, because this isn't something I do normally for my job. So yeah, I feel like having some context would make this stick a little better.
Yeah, the trailhead in the study guide it's a nice introductory overview. It's not horribly overwhelming.
Okay.
If you want to play with REST and SOAP services.
Yeah, absolutely. I will look at that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Jeff, you're up. And Jeff, we see you. If you're talking, we can't hear you because you're muted. So I'm sure you're saying lots of clever things. Oh, there you go.
I'm here now. Sorry about that. Trying to do multiple screens here to make it easier, and forgot to click all the buttons before I left. One more switch and we can get going here. All right. So I guess a little bit about Workbench first. In doing the REST stuff, when you first log in, anybody who has not used Workbench, you have to log into your org, and that's basically doing the OAuth piece of that to get in. Once you're in, it kind of shortened things for you when you do start making the REST call. So what was shown just previously, where you had to have the HTTPS and you put down your org, that's all handled for you behind the scenes with Workbench. So you don't have to worry about keying that in all the time. It makes it a lot easier for you. All you have to do is start with the services piece. You have the ability to do your different gets and posts, and I'm going to go through a couple of those. There's thousands of options here. What I want to do is just touch on a couple ones to give you a flavor, give you an idea. I've got some that are doing both queries, looking at S objects. I'll even do one that goes into a parameterized search with a JSON, just to give you kind of a flavor for what you can do. Anything that I'm doing here are things you can do from your code to do the exact same thing coming into Salesforce to get the data. This is just kind of a quick way to do it. So earlier, when we were doing that, you asked, how do I know which objects I have? So there happens to be a very good REST service, basically with, let me state one more thing. The version 43 here, you're specifying an API version, which when you're accessing data, most of the time doesn't matter. There are some things, the way it will get turned back to you, like when we switched the pick lists, when they went from pick list values to value sets, what you get back will then be slightly different depending on what version of the API is there. But most of the time, it doesn't matter when you're actually pulling data. And I'm only going to show pulling data. You can also use these in order to upload, update, everything else. I'm just going to do several different queries and accessing data. But the first one here, I'm going to run basically by just doing S objects. You'd ask earlier, what are all the objects? Well, right there, you can get it. So through one command, S objects, it'll basically tell you a list of all the objects that are in your org. By clicking each one at this level, it just gives you the very high level. Is this object, is it customizable? Is it editable? Are there layouts, etc.? So it gives you the very high level of what the objects are. You then make another call to actually get more details on the particular objects. And we'll dive into that. So after you've done a particular object, I just
Jeff,
want to show
before you go on, can you show the raw response? Because the Workbench makes the JSON response, or is that coming later? Am I stealing your thunder here?
No, I was going to do it later. We can do it.
Okay, great. No, that's fine. If it's in the plan, do it later.
Yeah, because this one will be a little overwhelming with all the stuff that came back. So, and as was talked earlier, if you give it an incorrect query, you basically are going to get an error back, and it will explain what's going on. Ultimately, you look down here, error code not found, the requested resource does not exist. But you'll see a lot of the stuff all up here with HTTP and all the things coming across with it. Then ultimately, you get a JSON error message. So it also handles basically what's going on there. So it also tells you up here, service not found, S objects. It doesn't have that particular service. So now let's get into some more details about a particular object. So we know we can find out what all the objects are, but now how do we find out just one? We'll put account, and at the very high level of account, all it's going to give you is some basic things. So it's again going to tell you on this object, is it mergeable, is it editable, queryable, all those very high level items, some URLs that you can use to actually get different kinds of layouts, get your various fields, list views. So once you get into this account, there's a lot of other calls that can be made to get all the various pieces. So if you're writing something that's, if you're using that partner, actually in this case, you don't use the WSDL, but this is where if you're writing an application that wants to come in, query what the objects are, query what the fields are, and start to build a structure, this is how you could step through various calls in order to get all the details of each org that you were doing. And another thing that the high-level account gives you is whenever you go to account, you get your recent items that you have gone to. You can also pull back now the recent items from the REST call also for the particular user. I'm logged in as me, so here's the latest things I've gotten to. So that's what you have at the very highest level. So now let's dive down further. We actually want to know what are the fields, what are the relationships, what are all the various details that are with that thing. So you add describe to the account, and now you can get into all the relationships that are for that particular object. You can get into all the fields. Open those up again. It'll have the high level details of what the field is like. It'll have pick list values if they're there, references that you have, all the details about all the fields, the relationships, everything within that object is also retrievable. Layouts, record types, everything about that particular object is available. So far we've looked at, you can get objects, you can get high-level details of a particular object, lower level details of a particular object. We haven't gotten any data yet. All we've really done is look at metadata. Real quick, I'll do it on the next one where we actually look at the raw stuff to see what comes back, because it'll make a little more sense there. So now let's say we want to actually get into object. So basically, again, account, you want to filter on an ID and you want to give it a particular ID. So now we're actually getting data. So now it will have all the fields that are associated with that object. You can see the larger fields, which are descriptions. You can see everything else. This will basically pull everything back because all we said was give us an object. So whatever fields I have access to, they're going to come back in this particular pull. If we look at that raw response, once we come down, you have all the top level stuff, which is just has to do with the call. Then you've got JSON basically that represents this item. So you see the object, we see basically attributes, which it tells us we've got an account and what the URL is. And then basically we have all of the fields and they'll be listed out all the way to the bottom. So it pulls back a large amount of data. So oftentimes, you know, a couple of different things you can do. It's not just restricted to the ID, but you can really take any field, even a custom field with a particular value. You can pass that in and again, pull back the data associated with that particular record. Again, it's going to be all of the fields. If you're not comfortable with doing that, let's say you want just a couple of fields. Well, you can get
hold
to
on, Jeff, slow down.
Yeah.
So this is a cool feature I didn't know about. So 2 lines up from what you have highlighted on your right-hand window where you're copy pasting from. So 2 lines up, basically what we said was, hey, I want an account and I want the account whose ID is, you know, whatever that cryptic ID is. But on the next line, you have a custom field called GPID, and now you're calling the REST web service and you're saying, hey, I want the account whose GPID is 5589. Is that
exactly?
Yep. So if I wanted to find like a contact with a last name of Smith, I could do /contact /last name /Smith, and it would find me like contacts with a last name of Smith then?
We'll do it.
Okay. And I don't even know if you have any contacts named Smith.
I'm going to end up not having, but I've got 75,000.
Smith is a pretty popular name.
So what didn't it like? Is it last name or is it last underscore name?
It looks like last name. I'm just looking at what's on your right-hand screen. Is it case sensitive? Does it have to be last cap and the name? The N on name has to be capitalized.
Interesting. It does not like.
Huh. Okay.
Well, so you can do that if you get the format correct.
Okay. I wonder if it has to be a numeric value or something.
Well, I'll show you a different way. There's a different way to do it. So you can. So if we decide we don't want every field, so now you can switch it from SObject. You can switch over to query, and you can actually put a SOQL statement in here. So, and I'm gonna add another one here just on the fly. So we want the ID and the name from account, and I'm not going to give it any other parameters. So when I run that, very interesting. You know what?
Oh, you still have the contact last name stuff in there.
Oh, yep. Oh, and I want to add another field in here. Does it still have it?
It's way back in the beginning. Yeah, so you've got it. You need to just delete that contact /last name /Smith.
There, that should be what we need. with my whole purpose of having all the queries ready for me. So in this particular case, I gave it no filter. So it basically came out and said, you know what? There's 28,222 records. I'm going to return back the first set of those. And if I open up records, you can see here that I'll have the first set. I think it's actually going to give 2,000 because that's what we can pull back in a single query. So what's interesting here now is you'll notice this thing that says next record URL. It basically is a format. So this is a defined query now that's within the system. There's a tag that's in there for it. I can go back and hit that same query and say, I want the next 2,000. So then I can go back and do it. And if I open that record now, it's hard to tell, but this is a different set now. So it says, okay, you grab. So I went and did a search on your thing. It's probably through ID, because I think that's a default query. There's 28,000 of them. I'm going to give you 2,000 at a time. And you could basically just loop through and keep making this query. So this is the way through the rest that you could get more than the 2,000 back, which is typically what you would get in a call. You could basically, if you know you had more records and you really wanted them all back, you could loop through this and keep calling back to that same item and get the next two, the next two, the next two. So it's a way to get more than that initial set of records.
Do you know how many API calls that's considered? Is that one call per set of 2,000, or is it considered the same continuous call?
I've got to believe it's one per set of 2,000 because you're making a call back in. So yes, in this particular case, we would use up a lot of records to get them all. So that's where you'd want to use something else if you're pulling all of them, but you could do it through REST. That's a way to actually get to it. So now that we really don't want all of the account, how can I do that same? So I do the query again, and I put a limit. So now in this particular case, I'm going to go back and I'm going to go out and get the name, and let's put the ID in here again. I'm going to get the ID and the name from account, and now I put in a where clause. Wherever you put in the where, you've got to make sure that that is URL encoded correctly. So that's why I've got the %25, which is really a percent, which is what you put on like in order to come back. So now from this query, rather than getting back 28,000, I'm now getting 51. So I have 51 accounts, and basically I've pulled back the ID and the name for all of those. Again, go through and look at those. So now I'm starting to narrow it down. I was able to look at the object, look at all the fields, look at details about what's going on. I was able to do a generic query against an account with a specific ID, and now account with various fields in general, or account with various fields having a specific filter on it in the where clause. So let's jump now to Salesforce's general search. There's also the ability to say I don't have to just limit myself to the account table. I want to go, and this parameterized search basically says that's that global search that's up in the top of your screen. So now I want to run the global search with my query. The Q here basically saying my query that I want to pass into that global search. I want to key in the Citibank again. So in this particular case, it's going to go out and it's going to pull in. Now it's hard to tell here, but if you see a 062A, that's basically an attribute of, that's an opportunity. So here's opportunities that have Citibank. If you look down a little further here, you'll see a 01A, which I know is an account. So now here are accounts that have Citibank in them. And we could probably look down further. Here's a 1F, that may still be an account.
You got some sort of custom objects, looks like too, with E3V.
Here's some custom. So basically, yes, you can access into the generalized search. The data that comes back, you're going to be able to tell what the type it is. Plus, it's going to give you a URL to go get more info on that data itself, and then the ID of that, because that's all I asked for. I could actually put not in this particular one, because this is going to the generalized search. But now let's say, okay, I want to do that generalized search, but I want to have a little more control over what I'm going to put in there.
So is this running SOSL in the background? Do you know? Since it's parameterized like that, it seems like more of a SOSL query than a SOCL query.
Actually, yes. When you do general search, it is a SOSL. I do remember reading that. I probably stated it incorrectly. So that search up on the top bar is a SOSL search. So now I want to, again, use that high-level parameterized search. I want to look for my search item is going to be Acme in this particular case. And now I'm going to put in some more parameters. So I'm going to tell it, I only want to look in the account. That's my S object. And I only want to pull back account fields, ID, name, and country. I also want the account limit to only be 10. So go out and find, again, a general search, look at account, pull back these particular fields, and only bring me back 10 items. So now I can put more control on that generalized search. You'll see now I only have 10 that come back. And I've got the ID, name, and country. So I was able to find what fields I want, limit the search that came back, and limit the objects I want to search against. And if you want to carry that one step further...
But wait, there's more.
There's more. And let's look at the raw response here again, because this is going to be a little easier to look at now. So I've got a bunch of search records. There's my array. Then the attributes with an account and a URL. Then I'm going to have the fields. I'm going to end up closing up that object and then start another object, same type of thing, attributes, account, and the field. So there's kind of like your structurized JSON that came back for that thing. This one's a lot easier to read than the one that came back of the big item. But if you want even more control, we can actually pass it JSON that tells what we want to come back if we have a lot more than we can put within. Now I'm just going to call parameterized search. I'm going to hand it nothing back in the query, but now I'm going to have some JSON that defines what I want. And let me put that in there and we'll kind of step through what's there. So in order to pass the JSON now, it's no longer a get, it's a post. So we're basically saying we want to query on Smith. We want to pull back fields, the ID, first name and last name. And then we want to get S objects, and it gets into another where we want fields, ID, and number of employees from the account with a limit of 2. And you can kind of see we close that part of the S object, and then we add another one where we also want to count. So the contact here is going to apply to the ID, first name, and last name. So we're going to pull those 3 fields from the contact, and we're only going to pull the ID and number of employees from the account. We're limiting the count to 20. We want to look in all, well, it says in all objects here, but we've limited it down to account and contact. So I'm not, to be honest, I'm not sure what the in does. Overall limit of 100, default limit of 10. I'm going to have to look more at what those parameters do, but it's a way now within the JSON to put even more stuff that would be hard to filter all this in the way I did it before. We run that query again, and now we can see some things that are 1A and 1F. We see some 3As and 3Fs down here, which will be the contacts. We'll open up that. So we have ID, first name and last name from a contact. And up here I have ID and number of employees from an account.
Powerful stuff.
And that just touches on the surface of all the stuff you can do with this.
And this is just the standard API. This is not something custom you created. This
Nope.
is just what comes
Standard
with
API.
Salesforce.
Standard API. And when they talked about the REST web services, if we'd have put in a REST web service, we could come back here, we would get rid of the data, the 360, I think the parameterized value, and we would just have that item that we put in the resource that was here, slash, and then whatever our actual method was. And then we could, again, either if it was inline parameters or if it was JSON, we could grab those to pass to that customized web service and do the exact same thing.
Wow.
The URL would be slightly different because we have to get the actual URL that she showed earlier on how to do that. But you could put that in here as well, either through a get if you had command line parameters or a post. So when you set up your web service, you indicate either a get or post or both method. And so if you call one that isn't available, it'll tell you that service isn't available. You switch it to post, and you can access that as well.
Right. And I think it's like services, and then I think you have to put like /Apex or /Apex REST afterwards.
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember what that format was. It's probably in.
Yeah. I remember I was trying to debug a system that I had inherited that had a REST endpoint, and I'm like, how do I get to this thing? And then I can't remember, but it was like /services/something, and then the URI name that was defined.
Right. And there's other places you can do this. SOAP UI does the same thing. You have to make the initial call yourself, and so you have to really set up two different things where you set up the initial call to do the login, the OAuth piece, which gives you back the session ID, and then you take that session ID and pass it to all the rest of these. Workbench hides all that from you, so you don't have to worry about underlying here. We would have to be sending a session ID, and it may actually be in my headers. Let me look. No, it's not there, but Workbench is doing some stuff for us here because because we now have a session, because we logged in earlier, that's being passed with what's being done here. All we have to worry about is the actual REST call and the parameters.
And you mentioned the SOAP tool. Is that in Workbench as well, or is that another tool that you use?
No, SOAP UI is a general tool that people use to test web services. It says SOAP UI, but it actually tests SOAP and REST services. That allows you, again, to set up a lot of the parameters, to control more of actual headers. When you have to define specific headers that go in, it allows you to set those passing certificates if you need that as part of a more robust type of connection. So it's a typical tool that people utilize when they're testing any kind of web services. I've used it for connecting into Salesforce web services as well, or when I'm connecting to some of the other ones that when Salesforce is doing their outbound calls, you can go test that service outside of Salesforce sitting on top and managing some of that control. You can make sure the service is working first, then you come back and start running it out of Salesforce to know that things should be working now.
Nice. And is it just soapui.com, or what's the URL to it? Or is it a plugin?
It's not a web service. You do have to install it.
Okay.
If you just look up SOAP UI, you'll find it. It is there is a free version of it that gives you, and I've always used the free. I haven't needed the extensive stuff, but there is a purchase version if you get into more details.
The most advanced REST and SOAP testing tool in the world is what they bill themselves as. Okay, I am adding that to the study resources page.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, if somebody wants to see some of that, I've got a bunch of that set up on my other computer that I can show. In fact, if somebody hadn't done the SOAP stuff, I could show making a SOAP call myself with SOAP UI.
Okay.
It sounds like somebody had already stepped in for that one. So.
Yeah, well, a tool was going to do it, but he got pulled away.
Right.
Is that something you could do like within 5-10 minutes? I want to leave some time at the end for the study group discussion, or we can save it for next time.
If he's got something set up, we could save it for next time. Let him run through what he's got.
All right, very cool. Any questions, guys? I'm like overwhelmed by this. I didn't realize there was so much available. It's cool.
Yep, yeah, we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I would really. I'll go back and look at the recording. From what I just heard, it's pretty good.
What I'll do with this is I didn't prepare a slide because it's really interactive. I'll take what I've got on my right hand and I'll put a little explanation above what each one does, and I'll put that in that same folder so that you guys have some examples and what they're trying to accomplish.
Cool, that'd be great.
Hey, Jeff, this is Terry. On that GPID one where you're doing the search for the 559, does that have to be an external ID for that to work? Or I know we tried it with our last name on contacts, but is that?
That may be.
That's
a good point. That may be an external ID, and I'll look at that, and then I'll put some notes in this as well, if that is an external ID required. What's done there? I just grabbed this ID because I knew it. Figuring any custom would do. So the fact we couldn't get the contact work, I'll look in that a little more and find out if there's restrictions on what ID has to be done there.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. While we were talking, Svadka posted, we had that big word idempotent, or maybe idempotent. I don't know how to pronounce it even. But she posted a design definition she likes, and it basically says that the service can gracefully accept multiple copies of the same message. And the example she put, if a subscriber operation fails to receive an acknowledgement, it may resend the message after a waiting period. And the second message could cause the publisher to act twice, but an idempotent or idempotent design will handle this by ignoring the subsequent copies and but it will acknowledge the receipt of the message, but it won't create duplicates in the system. So thank you for that, Svatka. All right. Any final thoughts before we pause recording? Okay, the recorded session is now finished, and we're going to go into a so-called closed door session with the group outside of recording mode, so please stay on.